Welcome to today's special webcast. I'm very delighted to you have joined us, and I'm here to join you for this really interesting conversation. My name is Amy Abel. I'm the Managing Director here for Human Capital at the Conference Board, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. And this is a conference keynote webcast, which is basically a best of the best highlights from our recent Diversity and Inclusion Conference. And it's a nice recap of some of the topics that were discussed at the conference, looking at future trends, challenges that we all continue to face as D&I professionals. So thank you again for joining me. We have some of the critical factors or questions that we will examine today on today's webcast. How organizations can support leaders and managers to face evolving trends in diversity and inclusion and to handle difficult conversations. Actually, let me rephrase this. We are going to talk about different elements and aspects of diversity and inclusion from the organizational perspective, what organizations can do, from an individual and team's perspective, right? How can we look at unconscious biases or D&I biases from ourselves and from our team? We'll also look at these challenges from a systems and technology perspective. So really interesting focus points around the different elements of D&I that is giving us many of the hints of what's going on in D&I today, as well as the future of D&I. And before I continue and introduce my panel, I wanted to invite you to ask questions during this webcast. You're welcome to ask questions by typing questions in the lower left-hand box. Please do participate. We really want to hear your questions and hear your thoughts, and I will feed these questions back to our panel. So please do join us. You can download the presentation, as you note in the box on the bottom of the screen. And at the end of this webcast, an evaluation will pop up with very quick 2 to 3 questions where you can tell us how we did on this webcast, or even ideas for future webcasts. We do look forward and would appreciate your feedback around that. And finally, from an administrative perspective, credits. If you would like HRCI credits, SHRM credits, CPE credits, you can see on your screen, you would type in your name at different points or click on the pop-up screens during the webcast, and we will note that and offer you those credits. All right. So, as we begin our conversation today, let me first introduce my panel. I'm very excited at the esteemed panel that we have. First, let me quickly introduce them, and then I'll ask each one of them to join us in this conversation. I have Shilpa Furwani, who is the Principal and CEO of IBIS Consulting Group. Shilpa is an organizational psychologist by training and leads IBIS, which is a global and diversity inclusion training and consulting firm. She provides subject matter expertise in change management, organizational development, and diversity to help organizations align their D&I strategies with business strategies. She has led effective programs for clients such as American Airlines, Brown University, Campbell Soup, ESPN, Microsoft, and many others that you will note. Thank you, Shilpa, for joining us on this program. I also have Dr. David Rock, who is the founder and CEO of Neuroleadership Institute. David coined the term neuroleadership and directs the Neuroleadership Institute, a global initiative bringing neuroscientists and leadership experts together to build a new science for leadership development. He co-edits their Neuroleadership Journal and heads up an annual global summit. He has written extensively on this topic and is certainly has a lot of really great thoughts around neuroscience. He received his doctorate in neuroscience of leadership from Middlesex University. So thank you also, David, for joining us today. And thank you. And I also have Stephen Scheinberg joining me in the studio. So thank you, Stephen. He is the General Counsel and SVP for Privacy and Security for Anti-Defamation League. He is responsible for protecting the organization's assets, reputation, people, and data. No pressure. Stephen writes about the intersection of emerging technology and employment law, arguing that modern risk management requires employment lawyers to have an extremely deep and sophisticated understanding of emerging technology and its use. And Stephen holds a PhD from Bowling Green University and a JD from Emory University. And certainly that intersection I think will be a really interesting part of this conversation because those of us that practice obviously in D&I and in HR more broadly, lots of things going on there, lots of changes, lots of technology. So I think this will be a very fruitful conversation. So great. So with that, let me just remind the friendly audience to join us in this conversation as we start. And let me turn to Shilpa first and say, again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for inviting me.
I had started the webcast by saying we wanted to look at some of the organizational perspectives around current D&I challenges and what organizations are doing. So I really kind of wanted to start with you on a couple of questions. Can you share with us what are some evolving trends that organizations are facing and what are they thinking about or what are they doing around some of this?
Yes, I think we are, in terms of where we are in the diversity, inclusion, and equity space, we've seen a lot of changes in the last few years, and generally organizations now are looking at doing more in terms of their workforce, workplace, and marketplace when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also with the training efforts in place. As some of you may have heard about the Starbucks, or most of you may have heard about the Starbucks training that was offered to all employees. Generally, organizations are looking at what more can we do to raise awareness around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in the workplace, but also how can we be more strategic in terms of embedding diversity and inclusion into every aspect of the organization. So looking at it more, not just from an individual perspective, but also from a systemic perspective, because that's where they see the real change happening. So both for training and for the systems work, there's a lot of exciting things that are being done at different levels of the organizations.
Yeah, no, lots of changes, you're right. And so what's prompting some of these changes? How are the D&I scenarios changing in the workplace? What's different, if you will?
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, if we look at the progress around diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of people will agree that when we look at leadership and we look at the senior levels of the organization, we don't see the kind of change that we would like to see. There's also been a lot of research around, is diversity training even effective? It started with an HBR article that came out in 2012 saying that diversity training doesn't work, or even recently in Forbes and Washington Post, where the article said that, unconscious bias training actually perpetuates the problems America strives to fix. So that raised a lot of questions around, has there been progress made? Is training actually helping or getting in the way of inclusion? And we've been doing this for a long time. We believe if training is not done in the right way, it's not going to have an impact on diversity and inclusion. And also just training is not going to help an organization move the needle, give leaders the tools and the skills that they need to have these difficult conversations. If we are almost in a place where the need is to have more of these courageous, bold conversations. It's great that there's been a lot of work around bias, unconscious and conscious biases, but what can leaders do to be an ally, to be an advocate, and to promote the diversity and inclusion agenda for their organizations?
Right. And I agree with you. You had mentioned briefly earlier around the sort of the systemic view or the systemic approach around diversity and inclusion. It's not just about the training. Certainly training is very critical, but what else about the elements of diversity and inclusion and biases that organizations need to face? So absolutely. So what should organizations do? How can they help their leaders and their managers with these difficult conversations?
Great. And so, Amy, let me talk about, what we've seen as some critical elements to make your diversity and inclusion strategy work and to make sure that the organizations move along on this journey. So with diversity and inclusion, I think it's really critical that any work being done within an organization aligns with the overall business strategy. So for you, if it is innovation or market penetration or talent acceleration, those are the things that the diversity training should focus on. Also, as I said earlier, training in itself is not going to move the needle, but within the training also look at both individuals and systems. Have leaders recognize how bias gets in the way of how things are structured in the organization. Everything from recruitment and hiring to career development to performance evaluation. And then we see enough rolling of the eyes when you talk about diversity work. Unless and until that is customized and aligned for every organization, we don't see the same level of impact. So to really customize and meet the client where they are, and ultimately also look at how are you going to measure the impact. Is there something that can be done before a diversity initiative and after, so that organizations know, did this help? And diversity training as a standalone option is not great. So diversity has to be embedded in all competencies and leadership management competencies, but all kinds of trainings being offered. And hold people accountable for it, have them follow through it, strongly encourage to attend these sessions, give them the tools so that they can look at how they can apply this to their day-to-day roles. Often people say, oh, we went to this session, it was good to hear why it's important for us to focus on diversity and inclusion, but what do we do differently? So give us the tools. And then I can't stress enough on I think it's time where organizations are now having some dialogues around, or need to have dialogue on issues around racism, sexism. So look at these difficult conversations and give leaders the skills and the tools that they need to have a dialogue on this topic. And, the articles that talk about the diversity training doesn't work, yes, if it's done only one time and doesn't incorporate all these elements, it is not going to be effective. So how do you keep it ongoing? And then the last one, we believe it is a serious topic, but people still need to have fun with it, laugh about certain things. So it's important to incorporate humor in any of your diversity inclusion training programs. Those are some critical elements that it helps to keep in mind when you think about rolling out any kind of bias or diversity related topic.
Great. And I think now we wanted to share a quick video. Is that correct, Shilpa?
Yes, so I would like to show an example of a scenario, and this is when we did the session at the conference, there were actors on stage. One way to make training fun and engaging and make sure that it sticks is interactive theater, where actors go in and perform scenarios that are scripted for the clients. So this scenario that you're going to watch, it is a scene in which a leader is talking about the need to select a new team lead, because Mark, who's the leader, is moving a current leader onto some other position. So Joe is the current leader who's being moved, and Karen has been on the team for a long time. Judy, one of the other characters you'll just see, is new to the team and has a very different style when approaching work. So you will see the team interactions. Now, I do encourage you, as you watch this scenario, look for what kind of conscious and unconscious biases you notice as this team interaction plays out. And also look for the leader, so Mark in this case, who's the leader, what was his role in a situation like this? Did he do anything well? Could he have done things differently? And feel free to send those in as comments as you notice any of these aspects during the scenario. So Amy, if you can go ahead and play the scene, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit more.
So we're going to eavesdrop on this conversation.
Okay, so we've narrowed down the options for the new project lead to 3 contenders: Cynthia, Annalisa, and Creighton. And I want to get your final thoughts before I make a decision on here. Oh, could one of you two please take notes? All right, now I think Cynthia is our best bet. She's a proven performer with good experience.
I don't know, Mark. She got a reputation for being hard to work with, rough around the edges.
What do you mean, Joe?
I guess it's her style.
Go on.
Well, she takes no prisoners, She's pushy.
Pushy?
Yeah, blunt and aggressive. People don't like working with her.
All people or just men?
What?
Well, men never get described as pushy. When they exhibit that kind of behavior, they're considered leaders.
Okay, let's focus here, okay? Now, I don't have any problems with her style. She's able to take charge. But my one concern is that she's been around a long time. You know, there's not much runway left.
Some people.
Are you saying that someone over 40 has no more potential for growth or advancement or to learn?
No, I'm just saying a project lead takes a lot of energy.
As in someone younger. I mean, millennials are fine. They could be great. But I think for this role, we need a seasoned performer.
I just want to make sure the new lead can get the job done.
Right, Joe. Which Cynthia can. Judy, do you want to say something?
No, thank you, Mark. That's all right.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's move on to Annalisa.
Annalisa, she's a better option because of continuity. Yeah. She's already on the team.
You've been lobbying for her hard.
Well, since you're taking me off the project.
Because I need you to take over Claude's project team.
I know. Annalisa is already familiar with the existing design product. She's been on the team for 6 months. She knows the team. She knows the challenge. And that continuity will go a long way toward keeping the momentum and making our target.
But Joe, she's in Pennsylvania. I mean, I know that there's emails, Jabber, WebEx, phones, but you can have conversations and decisions in a random conversation in the corridors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And Joe, you know, I also have a style issue with Annalisa. I mean, she's real introverted. She has no presence.
Yeah, she is really passive. And that accent?
What was that?
I was agreeing with Mark.
Also, Joe, didn't you say she misses deadlines?
I figured out that it had to do with her not knowing how to say no when I would give her a deadline.
So are you saying she's not reliable?
No.
May I say something?
Go ahead, Judy.
In some cultures, people often say yes because they don't want to displease their bosses.
Yes, but when they don't deliver, their bosses are displeased. So that doesn't make any sense. No, sorry, Joe. I just want to make sure that Annalisa stays on the team. I think that's where best suited for her talents, and it's better for the team. Okay, Creighton.
I feel awkward saying this, but I worry about Creighton being a lead.
Really? Why?
He's too laid back. He reminds me of Denzel Washington.
Oh, because he's black?
No, because he's smooth.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
That's not what I was going to say. My concern is that he hasn't been with us very long. He was in the military, then he was a athletic trainer, then he was in food sales before he came here.
Well, Creighton is very capable. Yes, Judy?
His previous experiences could bring a new perspective, more innovative ideas.
I don't know. I think we got a pretty good track record on how we do things around here.
Well, it'll certainly be important to have a lead who knows his way around the company, who knows the people and knows how to get things done. You know, I'm not really sure we should go with any of these candidates. I mean, we can't afford to get this wrong. You know, I want somebody like you, Joe.
What about Lydia's son from 7 East?
Oh, Sammy. Yeah. He went to my alma mater. Yeah. You know, with some mentoring, I think he would be a good fit. All right, I'm going to go talk to him.
By the way, Mark, you owe me a drink?
I was hoping you would forget that. You know, that point spread wasn't as big as you predicted.
But we won.
What game were you playing, Joe?
We were just watching, Karen.
Seeing you play on a team, that's something I'd pay to see. Not.
And the meeting is over.
So, Shilpa, I wanted to note that thank you to the audience. A whole number of comments came in around that, so I'm going to very briefly mention and read a couple of them because I think we need to move on with the conversation and have you summarize and synthesize for us. But some of the notes were, asking the women to take notes, or I don't think he should have asked them to focus instead of having a great opportunity to have a difficult conversation. Describing candidates as aggressive, age bias, code words that are used to describe and illustrate biases, culture fit and hiring internally, and what's the diversity in the workforce based on that. Bias against flexible work. There was definitely shutting down of ideas. Liking me bias, not valuing different identities and experiences. Someone like you, kind of comment, someone like you, considering good fit, in quotes, what's a good fit? Gender bias, inside jokes, sort of sports camaraderie or other sort of biases. So thank you to the audience. Let me turn it to you, Shilpa, so that we can continue the conversation with your synthesis.
Thank you, Amy, for summarizing that. And, yes, there was a lot going on in that scenario, but the point here was to see sometimes there are these conscious and unconscious biases related to different dimensions of diversity. And generally, what is the role of the leader here? Because there were so many opportunities where the leader could intervene, or even one of the team members could speak up as an ally, but we did not see any of that happening. So in your particular organizations, for the participants, some of this you may have related to, and others may have felt, okay, we have leaders who would actually step in and say something if a comment like this were made. But how do you give these leaders the tools that they need to intervene and be an ally and advocate? So one of the tools that we use, it's called Flex, and a lot of this diversity and inclusion work starts from with self-awareness, right? To look within to see what are your favorites, your feelings, what are some assumptions that you may be making. So that's the journey that starts by looking within, and then to really learn about and from others. What can we learn from different perspectives? And then the third piece here, the E, would be more around engaging in dialogue. How do you have this difficult conversation? Separate intent from impact. And then lastly, and one of the most important pieces, especially for leaders, is how do you expand your option in terms of systemic changes that you can make in a situation like this? So this conversation needed to focus more on competencies. Somebody needed to call out more around what's a good leader, what do we call a good leadership style, and why are there these assumptions in place? Can we open up the opportunity to all kinds of candidates? So those kind of changes need to be made at the systemic level. And this is, again, a really good framework for any diversity and inclusion work. If you look at embedding it, it has to be part of workforce, workplace, and marketplace. And for workforce, everything from recruitment and hiring, career development, succession planning. For workplace, aspects like leadership accountability, your organizational climate. And then ultimately, it's about branding too. How does your marketplace perceive you? So look at embedding diversity and inclusion in all aspects of this organization so that you can move your organization from the awareness level, which is basically compliance, to integrating it, focusing on inclusion, to the third level where it's more sustainable. It becomes every aspect of the organization. And then the last would be that you see the representation at different levels of the organization. As I said early on, we have not seen a lot of progress when you look at senior levels of the organizations. And our aspirational goal here is that we look at these numbers and say, yes, we've moved the needle when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Shilpa, because this really helps us think through D&I from that systemic perspective, right? That it's broader across the organization. It's not just about training one person or even training a group of leaders. How do we, integrate, sustain, lead around it? So that's a really good organizational perspective. And maybe I can now turn to David, where we can look a little bit about the extensive work that you've done, David, on neuroscience and within your institute. Can you share with us sort of recent insights and how is this impacting D&I work in organizations? Sort of what's different, what's going on there?
Thanks, Amy.
Yes,
Can you
sir.
hear me okay there? Excellent. We got into this space as a research institute about 5 years ago because it seemed like actually the biggest problem happening in all of people development, HR, talent management. It was the biggest hurdle. And by that I mean it was an issue that was big, getting bigger, and everything people were trying wasn't working. And we got into the space as a research institute first and then started working with organizations about 2.5 years ago. We're working now with about 80 of the world's largest organizations, including about half of big pharma, many of the big investment banks, a really broad swathe of government in many countries as well. But you know, we're a research institute at the core, and I want to give you a couple of foundational pieces of what the research says, and then we'll dig into what the science is saying about mitigation itself. The first thing is, you can see on screen there, it's really a fact now that more diversity and inclusion does uplift performance. That there's so much evidence for that in every possible way. It's not really a question anymore. It's really interesting to note how it happens, though, and it happens at the team level. We wrote a paper on this called Diverse Teams Are Smarter in HBR, and it's helpful to study how it works. It works at a team level where diverse and inclusive teams have higher team intelligence, which is actually quite stable across tasks and across time, and variable between teams. So you're really talking about making teams smarter. But here's the challenge, and point 3 here, is that it doesn't feel like that. That diverse and inclusive teams do actually do better, but they actually feel like they're doing worse. And there's been a number of studies on this that it feels like you're going slower, that you're less effective, that you're less efficient. And these are some important things to kind of begin the conversation with. And we do believe that addressing bias is a key, but little progress is being made in many organizations around this. And we looked at the science and tried to understand kind of what everyone was missing, because literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars over decades have gone into unconscious bias training, but there's really little evidence until recently that there's some results. So we published a paper on this a couple of years ago now, and it was a big piece of research for us, our biggest ever. And to be honest, in the journey, we actually got really depressed in the first year or two, because we discovered that there actually really wasn't any way to reduce bias. That Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in this, was right. Wikipedia was right at the other end. And everyone in between who's actually studying this was right, which was that you can't actually make people much less biased. It's a real problem. And it's not anything to do with the quality of training, and it's not about how motivated they are, or it's not about how much self-awareness they have. You can make, with some increase in mindfulness, you can make some progress on bias, but it's very, very small amounts. The fundamental issue is not motivated cognition. It's not that people don't want to think of themselves as biased. It's that they physically don't see themselves as biased. No different to they don't see infrared, and they don't see sound waves. They don't see these things. They don't see bias. They don't see infrared. They don't see sound waves. And there's really nothing you can do about any of those without significant, intervention from technology in some way. And so we looked at this and we tried to work out what to do about it. And here's the 3 big points that we got to. Firstly, bias isn't just a people thing. It actually matters with business decisions just as much. So a poor investment decision, a poor strategy decision, these things affect businesses a lot. And it's actually helpful to get everyone involved in mitigating bias if you think about all types of decisions. There's more at stake and there's more practice. And it's not just about, it's not seen as just about a people thing. It's a business issue now. Here's the big point. We actually don't think there's enough return on investment trying to make individuals less biased at all. We think the whole focus has to be on teams. And the reason for that is you can see other people being biased in real time. While you can't see yourself, you can see it in others if you have common language. And the challenge, though, is that language can't be 100 biases or 20 biases or even 10. It needs to be something really sticky and clear and simple and memorable, which is really hard to do. It took us 2.5 years to develop a framework that actually was sticky and accurate. And then the third issue, which is probably the hardest issue to solve for, is there's no one way to mitigate bias, because bias is many different things. There are biases that come from categorizing people as similar to you. There are biases that come from over-indexing on dangers and not thinking about upside. There's biases that come from just a bit of cognitive laziness. There's all sorts of different types of biases driven by really different processes in the brain. And you can't actually just give a team a tool that says, hey, slow down, try to be less biased or be more thoughtful. You actually need to know the kind of bias that's happening in the situation, and then you can actually address it really directly. It's like keyhole surgery versus surgery with a hammer. Keyhole surgery, you go right into the exact issue, and with minimal invasive actions, you fix something. Whereas, with a hammer, you're creating a lot of damage. Maybe something will happen. But we think that, telling people to slow down isn't a hammer. It's not a terrible thing to do, but it just doesn't really get the result in many, many of the biases. Probably works 20% of the time. So that's what we saw. We developed a framework called the SEEDS model. It categorizes everything into these 5 categories. You can see it there based on how the brain works. And what we found, teaching this very high level to large numbers of people, about 95% of people who learn this, and a very, very light touch, a digital thing, are doing something differently 1 to 3 times a week. So we're finding managers who we primarily work with, every single manager will do something differently 1 to 3 times a week after learning this. And they're quite specific differences. But it comes from being able to catch a bias, not in yourself, but in a conversation happening around you. Similarity bias is where people who are similar to you are better than others, etc. So here's to summarize, this is the core research we've done. We did a big paper on the SEEDS model. We did a paper on inclusion, which looks at how we need to actively include and not focus on exclusion so much, but focus on active inclusion. And we also wrote a paper on recruiting that looked at why we're not seeing results in recruiting and how to actually address that. Because it's really 3 separate processes that need bias mitigation in 3 different ways. So that's the core research that we've done. We're now, as I mentioned, working with lots of different organizations on applying this. The team level is critical. So getting teams to label bias. What do? Ideally, they develop what are called if-then plans. So an if-then plan has about 20 years of research behind it. It's technically known as an implementation intention. An if-then plan is something like, if I'm having a virtual meeting with people on the phone and people in the room, then call on people on the phone first. Right, that's an if-then plan. And tell everyone about your if-then plan, much more likely to happen. Or an if-then plan, like if I'm interviewing someone in person and someone on the phone, interview them both on the phone. Going to mitigate distance bias a lot. So there are these if-then plans that are built on this particular type of bias and particular mitigation strategies that work. And what we see is thousands and thousands of these if-then plans happening at a team level immediately after learning this, and that's where we see the change. So we're studying lots and lots of sites where people are willing, and in a company of 10,000 employees and 1,000 managers, you can expect 50,000 different decisions a year, at least 50,000 different hiring and promoting and rewarding and investing and planning decisions, 50,000 across the business. And that's where you start to see the real grassroots change. So we looked at this challenge from really the core biology, discovered that the trying to address individuals was just not worth it, looked at teams, worked out teams needed common language, and then also worked out that you needed specific mitigation. And it's a lot, but it is actually working. And the meta story that's interesting, the meta story is everyone has bias. It's just part of the brain. It's not a bad thing. It's just how we work. We say if you have a brain, you have bias. It's not really your fault. We're not talking about, we're not talking about racism and sexism. So everyone has bias. It's not really your fault. You can't actually address it all the time. We're talking about 1 to 3 times a week, not 1 to 3 times an hour. You can't address it all the time, so you have to thoughtfully address it. And then finally, you actually need help. You can't address it on your own. If you're going to address bias, you actually need the help of people around you. And this message that's woven throughout the work. This message, I think, helps a lot. It helps people to kind of destigmatize bias and actually realize that they need help and that they can't do it alone. So that's what we've been doing. We've been publishing a lot in this space. Everything I'm going to show you from here on is publicly available, so I encourage people to look these up and read these. And we put a lot of work in our content team into just raising the awareness of the science and the wider community, separate to our own membership or consulting work. So this is all stuff that we're putting out into the public domain that we want people to understand. There's a whole paper on why diverse teams are smarter, again, really well referenced. These are online as well as in print in different places, but online is the best version. You can click through to all the references. The why diverse teams are smarter is really important. The second one, diverse teams feel less comfortable. That's why they perform better. That's a big one. And then industry publications as well. We've been publishing a lot in Quartz. These are quite useful as internal business case articles. They're short, pithy, kind of catchy. So the Yanni versus Laurel debate is a perfect example of bias. We've been writing about performance reviews and bias. Did a big piece recently on sexual harassment and digging more into that and the relationship between power and harassment. I'm happy to dig into that if people are interested. In Fast Company, diversity makes inclusion harder. Here's what to do about it. So a big piece on how to actually be proactive around inclusion. Strategy in Business, we publish a lot. The original paper on seeds is called Beyond Bias. You'll find that in Strategy in Business. A really provocative piece that we wrote is your company's diversity training making you more biased? And the cliff note there is just don't make it mandatory. Make it compelling. Don't make it mandatory, make it compelling. There's a whole lot of research on that one. So that's what we've been up to. New work that we're doing, let's go back to a few things. New work that we're doing is around harassment and bullying, sexual harassment, all of that. And we're seeing that the way to fix that is the middle. It's the middle of not the really painful issues and not the small issues, but the issues that are kind of gray. And our insight on that is that the sort of push to involve HR is discouraging people from speaking up about everyday things, and it's creating some tacit approval, some tacit acceptance. So we have a point of view coming out on that, and reach out to me if you're interested in that at all. But we think that the law coming out of New York State's actually got some problems around mandating harassment training. The way that they're doing the harassment training or requiring it actually, we think, discourages the bystander effect, and that's where we think the real change comes from. So that's what we've been up to. You can see our points of view and our research, and I'm happy to dig into this. I do agree with everything Shilpa said. Absolutely everything she said. I think we've just gone deeper into one or two pieces that she talks about. We've just gone a few clicks a little bit deeper into how do you actually get those conversations happening? And we think having some common language that's very scientifically based really helps get those conversations really happening.
No, David, that's
Amy,
great, because I think what you've said just sort of reinforces the systematic view, right, and looking at that Shilpa was talking about, and how we can take this issue, from the organizational level and then bringing it down to, the team level. I think it is very provocative for us to start thinking about, well, maybe it's not at the individual level. Maybe it is at the team level. What does this mean? What does this mean for my firm? What does this mean for the work that we're doing? And you also talked a couple of things that I believe Stephen will have a lot to think about and say, which is around the technology, using technology perhaps to help some of this, right? And then of course some of the legal changes that you're referencing, which we know Stephen is also a lawyer by practice. So I'm definitely thank you for bringing that very, very interesting perspective. And again, to the audience, you do have a couple of questions, so thank you for chiming in on that. I believe some of the questions that have already been asked, some of them have already been addressed by David as well as by Shilpa. So let me just, in the interest of time, turn it over to Stephen for a second, and then we'll come back to more questions. So if you do feel another compelling question, please do write that into the box in your screen. So we could sort of expand this and go into, tell us what's going on, in technology. And I know you're actually specifically going to talk about artificial intelligence, AI, and what's going on there. And of course, feel free to direct it back to some of David's comments, which I think connect directly to some of the thoughts that you had been preparing for this.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's great to hear my colleagues on the panel speak. ADL, my organization, has been involved in the anti-hate work for over a century, and one of our key programmatic offerings relates to diversity and inclusion training, particularly in schools and with police departments, and using team methods and using allies in that, helping students in particular become allies in opposing bigotry has been one of our methods of operation, and I think it's reflected nicely in the idea that you can't always change what's in someone's heart, but you can certainly give others the tools to approach it. Thank you to my thoughts today. One of the places we often go to solve problems of diversity and inclusion, could be technology. It's a very reasonable place to turn. But as my colleagues were saying, bigotry is sometimes built in, and one can have the best of intentions and still come out with biased and troubling results. And the fact is, artificial intelligence and the systems like it are human tools, and they are human endeavors, and they have human biases built in. And data scientists, the people who do some of this work, are also not D&I experts. So when we turn to some of the contemporary uses of tech in the workplace, it's being used in places where humans are supposed to be making, or humans make decisions. So we try to train systems to help augment or even replace the decision maker in what they're doing. And this plays out in numerous areas in the employment world, particularly, I think, in hiring, resume screening, etc. So we take gobs of experiential data, process it, understand it, and try to come out with a method of assisting the decision maker. The problem is that we don't often understand what data we're using. And it behooves us all, data scientist or not, DI specialist in particular, to really dig in and ask, where's the data coming from? If I'm being asked to rely on a piece of software, which is designed by the best and brightest minds out there, undoubtedly, to process information about my candidates or about my employees, I have to ask what biases are being encoded in that information. So if I might, you can consider the example in the video. Here we have a group of people figuring out who's going to be the next leader, and ultimately someone's going to be going to move up in the chain. Well, there's going to be a reflection of the success of that person, a success of their role within the company in the data that we generate from it. We're going to know that person, this kind of person with this background, etc., was successful within the company. And we're going to try to screen for those people who are successful. Well, we now know from the video, we now know that can have all sorts of, we understand can have all sorts of bias built into it. So while we're sitting and talking to each other about how do we teach people not to engage in biased behavior, we are sometimes tempted to look at the algorithm, because algorithms don't discriminate. They just do the work they're assigned. The problem is that data itself can be built on flawed assumptions about what success is, who is successful, what the background of successful or unsuccessful people look like. We could dive deeper into some of these topics, but that was my...
It makes me think of a perfect example, which is, let's just say you were looking for a new CEO, and you said, well, we're looking for a fabulous, best, whatever that meant, new CEO. And we decided, well, why don't we go to the Fortune 500 CEOs and look at all their profiles and say, well, what makes them successful? And do, statistical analysis and all sorts of data crunching to say, well, let's present what the Fortune 500, surely these people are all successful, and come up with, the answer for us to find a new CEO. Right. But to your point around going to the data, looking at the biases, for example, I know in the Fortune 500, there are, I think, 24 or 26 female CEOs. Right? So inherently, if you go directly to the data, you'll probably come up with a male CEO when in fact there may be other candidates that are perfectly qualified and perfectly capable. So that's just an example
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
where going to the data and answering and asking
Right.
about the data may be helpful. But so how are companies doing this? How are they thinking about this today? And do you have any examples of where companies are either working with, struggling with?
Well, we've seen a number of companies come, face to face with discrimination-related issues arising out of the use of data. Sometimes it's hard to know when and where because these processes exist sometimes deeply under the hood, right? With the software you purchase. I mean, the poor guy. I was in a room with a salesman trying to talk. We were replacing our HR systems, and the guy's telling me about the AI behind this, and boy, did we have a conversation. We have to understand, and the companies, as they wrestle with this, have to understand what it is they're buying. Right? They have to understand the data sets that they're purchasing and what work's been performed on it, who's performing that data, that work on it. They have to understand whether or not the data is accurately, as you said, reflects the population. Right? Does it take previously understood biases and encode it in favor of certain classes and individuals? What data was used, what data wasn't used? Right? What have we rejected? Right? Have we rejected data that might reflect that another group or set of individuals chose a different path because of headwinds at the organization? We have to understand the data science that underlies how we're looking at the data. Because, look, at the end of the day, this is human work. Data mining, data analysis, using these systems are all human work, and they will encode our biases. And we, at our own peril, we ignore that, or worse, don't understand enough about what's going on under the hood to ask the right questions. And the outcome can be disastrous, both from a DI and a legal point of view.
Yeah, no, I think I actually, as in some of my research, have been digging deeper into this whole AI realm, specifically within HR. And a common concept that keeps coming up is things around ethical use, biases, the darker elements of AI in some of the work. And by the way, for those of us that are thinking about AI and HR, who's doing this, how they're doing this, this is very, very big. Companies are absolutely actively using, implementing, thinking about, strategizing AI in HR processes and applications. Everything from talent acquisition, as you mentioned, talent selection or talent filtering, leadership development, executive coaching, succession planning, all of these sorts of examples, all the things that we know and familiar with in HR, including D&I work, and there's certainly a lot of concerns. And so I guess, this whole topic around trends in D&I, as practitioners, we need to be more forward-thinking as well as broader thinking. Right. No one's saying we need to become experts in AI. I'm certainly not going to become an expert in AI, but I think to your point, how to ask more questions. Do you have an example of, you don't have to mention the company name, obviously, but of an organization or a company that is now currently struggling with, how are they thinking through, or what is the example, even a high-level example, how are they challenged with this? I'm just wondering. Yeah.
I can give you two quick examples. One is just purely science-based, right? And that it's a theoretical set of work, and a bunch of very serious scholars took dictionaries, English language, and worked with AI models to try to train them using language and associations, creating associations. And the results reported in Science, I think last year, were tremendously disheartening, right? Because you take the corpus, for example, of written language and dictionaries, and you try to derive from it, all of a sudden you realize you're getting, words like programmer, engineer, scientists being associated with males, and nurses, librarians, and teachers being associated with females. It's not because anybody at the project sought to encode that language. What they realize is that by adopting the corpus of English language, which is one very common training method for AI, they adopted the unconscious bias that's deeply encoded in our language, or sometimes the conscious bias that's encoded in our language. Another company, a bank, was trying to bring in try to improve its promotion system. And it typically relied on sort of who went to the best schools and who sort of knew whom. And when they worked to encode that, they ran up against some very serious problems. First, they ran into questions that we all would, right? They had to have performance data. They had to have performance data that was usable. They had to have performance data that was able to distinguish properly between high and actual low performers, right? So it was objective data. That managers were being consistent in the data that they're using. That the people who were encoding, who were actually taking the written forms and putting them into digital form, were doing so consistently, understood the language. And once you took all those factors, those unknowns, and added them to the simple question of how do we align our next set of leaders with the categories of success, we find out that humans in every place are touching and manipulating and handling and choosing. And those biases will build in. And this bank recognized, I think, that it did not have a realistic handle on how it was going to promote its next generation of leaders. More relevantly, I think, for a lot of us, it encodes previous success. The fact is, some people got better performance reviews. Their data was encoded accordingly because they were like the manager. This is one big confirmation bias mess, and we have to be cautious.
No, I think those of us that do day-to-day HR work, whether it's around selection or promotion or performance reviews, etc., we know there's inherent bias. This is a sort of state of being that David already mentioned and suggested. And so I think I'm pausing because as I'm thinking deeper about this, I'm like, how do we remove that? How is it even possible that we're going to take on this challenge? And yet, everything that I'm reading and seeing and talking to, AI is coming like a big wave.
Yep.
Right? And no one's asking the questions. And how are we not going to end up like the Terminator movie is sometimes my thinking, but that's another conversation. But what can we do? What can we start? Let me bring it to a very practical level for the audience that is listening in. What can we do at the very practical level, which you've already started talking some about, right? Asking questions and understanding the data points. How else can we have these conversations with our colleagues, with ourselves, to take on this wave of AI that's definitely coming and better prepare ourselves for this wave?
Well, I think we have to, first and foremost, start with what my colleagues were saying. We need to understand, train around, deal with, and have common language and responses to bias. We need to be able to be in that conversation on a general level before we're into the specifics. I think we need to recognize that diverse teams that are essential to building and deploying HR systems, and we should insist that from our vendors and ourselves. There are corrective data science techniques that are out there. They're in their infancy, but it's a big movement. You can audit your results using standard testing, but you can't demand compliance by fiat. You can't just knock out gender in the consideration, because the encoding will have it elsewhere. And you will not be successful by just really not considering, ordering the machine not to, the tools not to consider gender. And finally, you can't simply just code it out. You're not looking for a better algorithm. The question is, and will remain, I think, in the data set you're using. And you have to be able to interrogate it. Where's it from? What's it from? What does it have? If it's your own data, your own history of success, you have a good handle based on the conversations that we've had about what the biases that are implicit and explicit in that data is. But, and finally, make a salesperson's life difficult by asking the questions.
I think it'll be really tough, because even like with the bank example that you just shared, if they come to this realization, which they have, but then they can't use that data, right? And then
it's less that they can't use the information they have. They should just understand what it's doing, right? And what results it's giving, and test those results in EEOC compliance, for EEOC compliance, and make sure that we understand that we're using the best corrective data science out there, and make sure that we're interpreting the data with diverse, knowledgeable teams. It's a tool. It's like the hammer and the keyhole surgery that was mentioned before. You can, they're different devices. They have different roles. If you use it properly, it's not a substitute for human judgment, because it is human judgment. So we need to be educated and smart, and not, turn on the machine and try to let it do its magic, because it's not magic, it's people.
Right.
We need to account for that.
Yeah, no, it's like you're bringing me into deep thoughts. So I have to ponder this over a couple hours from now, and perhaps with wine. But I'm curious, just where we've got a couple more minutes left, if you had a response to David's provocative thought around, mandatory compliance training, and that it may be less effective, but this obviously goes into the legal realm, and wondered if you had a thought around that.
Well, David is obviously the scientific expert here, and I wouldn't doubt his results. I think that forcing people to do things like that leads to a very big remove between the individual and their and the program they're watching, or what they're being involved in. The interactivity that Shilpa talks about, the creating, I love the idea of creating the drama to deliver that work. I love the idea that you can't change necessarily what's in someone's heart, but you can give them the tools to work around that. As David suggests, you can give others the tools to have a dialogue and have the conversation. I think those are both extraordinary ideas.
And Amy, if I could just add to what Stephen just said, yes, what I agree with David, that making it mandatory sometimes just puts people off. So how can we make it more compelling and engaging so that people want to go? Generally, what we like to see is that once people attend one session, the word of mouth that this was different. It will actually help us do our jobs better. That's what people need to realize about diversity and inclusion. That it's not a check the box. Yes, we did this training, but how will each one of the participants benefit and relate to their role and responsibility after attending the diversity and inclusion or bias training?
No, and I think and back to yours and David's point around the types of tools or the types of training, maybe this is sort of a evolutionary thinking around D&I training, or at least it is for me and some of the colleagues that I work with. David's point around empowering the teams, right? So it's not the individual. That's different, right? That's a different way to look at this type of approach. And I mean, maybe as a last thought, David, I didn't know if you wanted to chime in to say, how are organizations experiencing this empowerment of the team versus the individual training, and to some effect or to some storyline around something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the team level work is important. Teams can do three kinds of tasks. They can mitigate bias three ways. They can mitigate on the spot with just a different decision. They can create these if-then plans that I talked about. That's what they do a lot of. But they can also build what are called preventative measures. And a preventative measure is a system-level strategy. It might be technology, it might be process. But these decisions to put in a preventative measure happen at a team. Now, that team could be the CEO, it could be the board, it could be the marketing team. But if you have teams of people developing preventative measures as they see them, then you get this huge momentum. So it's really a combination of these sort of on-the-spot decisions, if-then plans, and what are called preventative measures that stop the chance of bias right at the source. So we're seeing teams driving those things, and as a result, a lot of change is actually happening quite quickly.
Great. Thank you. Oh, and I see I'm getting the flag time. Thank you, all of you. It was definitely thought-provoking, something evolving, something changing, technologies, organizations, teams, and individuals. Lots to think about. So I hope the audience will also take that away. If I can invite the audience further, we have a West Coast Diversity and Inclusion Conference coming up in December. Please feel free to join us, as well as other related resources at the conference board. I hope you, again, took away that systematic perspective, the broader thinking, if-then plans, right? These are really, I think, interesting comments, interesting phrases, but also helps us reinforce what's going on in our space, and then the need to sort of really partner with some of our technology or AI friends in the organization, or perhaps vendors. What do we do with all of this? Remains a challenge, remains a huge learning endeavor, but I hope you're inspired like I am. There's always something new to learn, and it keeps things a little bit interesting. So again, my name is Amy Abel. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please give us your feedback in the comments with the survey that pops up, and I hope you can join us for our next webcast. Thank you.